We are in Westbank communities with Chief Robert Louis in British Columbia, Canada. Welcome to Investment and Development Program that we produce in Guatemala and all over the world.
Thank you, Luis.
For us, it's a pleasure to have you here as a businessman, as a chief of the Westbank community. We would like to know about you personally first, your personal vision, how do you see economic development, and then we are going to be in touch about your projects in your communities.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have been the chief of my community now for 23 years. I was a counselor prior to that in 1974, and I've been involved in many forms of politics and economic development for better part of 40 plus years. I work with First Nation communities across Canada in things like land management, and one of the most recent ventures is working with Indigenous peoples from around the world in an economic development forum where we can share benefits economically, that we can share services and share business ventures together with people from Guatemala, from Chile, from all over the world, and that's what we're looking at right now.
That's very interesting, Chief. How do you get involved your community with the vision of economic development that is very important to improve the life of your people?
Well, economic development is a cornerstone and a requirement for Indigenous peoples. Without business opportunities and investments, you miss a large part of what's needed in the community. So for us, my community, the Westbank First Nation, we are heavily involved in economic development ventures. For example, for us, we do a lot of real estate and commercial development. We work with partnerships with developers in building things like shopping centers. We work with individuals who are very knowledgeable in the forestry industry, and we have an operation that we have put together with the province of British Columbia that we control over 152,000 acres of land. And in that we have a license to cut the timber and have a requirement to look after the land, the animals, the plants, the reforestation of the timber, and it provides jobs and opportunities for our people. And it's been working very, very well for us for many years now. And we also have other joint venture partnerships with other developers to build residential developments or other commercial developments. And this is something that we are involved with, and it's something that works very, very well for us. And for us, what is important to accomplish that is that we have our own form of governance. We are a self-governing community, and with that, we make our own laws, and that helps us immensely in promoting and fostering the economic development opportunities that we pursue.
Chief Robert Louis, natural resources are very important to develop communities, First Nations here in Canada and also all around the world. How do you use your natural resources but in a sustainable way so you can generate economical development for your people?
Well, I'll take forestry, for example. What we do there is that it's something that's very important to have forests that are well kept, well preserved. So when we cut the timber down, we do it in a very proper way. We take care of the environment, and we reforest the trees that we cut down. When we build the roads, sometimes those roads are rehabilitated. They are bulldozed over again and replanted. In other cases, some of the roads are left for entrance to and from the timber locations. But having protection of the animals and the plants is very, very important for us, and that will help us in the long-term sustainability of the forest. And that's something that we as Indigenous peoples really pay attention to, and we're very, very cognizant of, and this is very important for us to have proper practices in place. So that's how we would look after natural resources, both renewable and, in some cases, unrenewable. In those cases, we have large gravel pits or aggregate supplies, and if those are going to be pursued and if we're going to extract aggregate from the lands, then it has to be properly done, and the land has to be very carefully preserved once that operation is finished. So no large pits left on the land, but then it is reviewed and planned such that the lands would be shaped in accordance with the land as it used to be prior to extracting aggregate.
Chief Louis, how do you develop infrastructure in Westbank First Nation? Because we know infrastructure is very important to develop communities and countries.
Yes, it is. Infrastructure to have proper power, to have the roads, to have the water services, to have all of the infrastructure needed to sustain economic development is very, very important. So for us at Westbank, we are a self-governing community. We put laws in place that will actually confirm the depth of the water lines, the sewage line requirements, how far away that we must be from any water bodies, whether they're rivers or creeks or streams or any water bodies. There is so many meters that we must stay away from those water bodies to protect the environment. So the infrastructure is put in place being very mindful of that. And what we do then is that we put together the projects with very intensified planning so that we know the long-term requirements of where the infrastructure is needed and for how long. And so everything is put together with very complete, comprehensive planning so that it is done properly and it meets the economic development requirements that are needed once development occurs.
Amazing projects, Chief Robert Louis. How many people are in your communities and how they get involved in the duties in order to achieve the goals that you define, and how is the administration of those kind of business in order to get excellent results as you are doing now?
Well, firstly, our nation, we are part of the Okanagan Nation of Okanagan Sioux peoples. And in that nation, we have upwards of maybe close to 15,000 people if we look at our whole nation. Now with that, in our community, the Westbank First Nation, we have approximately 10,000 people who reside within the boundaries of our communities. Of the population, our total membership with Westbank First Nation is about 815 band members that are actually members of the Westbank community, actually registered with us as Westbank First Nation. And so when we deal with the overall population, of course we have different requirements, policies, procedures, and how matters are dealt with. So for us, we would put laws in place that would dictate land use planning, for example, what can and cannot be put on the lands, how it is going to fit with the overall development. And we have many non-native peoples who live within our boundaries of our lands. And in that particular case, we allow them to participate through an advisory council. And in that advisory council, the non-natives, who represent the majority of our people who live on the lands, they have a voice. And that voice allows them to be heard in matters of property taxation, for example, of what they would like to see tax dollars spent on, and we include them in that process. And as a result, we believe that we've developed a government that really works well and connects well with all individuals who reside within the reserve boundaries.
We're going now to a commercial cut, but we'll be back soon in a few seconds. Investment and Development. Here we're filming our programs in Vancouver Island, Canada.
Chief Robert Louis, tell us how was before you started the administration of the resources, because we recognize that you are a pioneer, you have a good leadership, and you are transforming these communities.
Thank you, Luis. Yes, there has been dramatic change over many years now. The first time I was elected to politics as a counselor for my community at Westbank, it was in 1974. At that time, Westbank was a very small community. Our whole offices, we operated out of a 10-foot wide by 28 feet long trailer. And there was enough administration monies to have one secretary hired and one band administrator, which three of us, the elected chief at that time, myself as a counselor, and another counselor shared the salary. So at that time, we used to deal with the government, Department of Indian Affairs, and they made all the decisions. So for us, we had no decision-making capacity. We had no development, we had no infrastructure to speak of, and everything was dependent upon government. So what we did is we dealt with that particular process, but over time, we realized that that had to change, that we needed to have our own ability and to create our own avenues to pursue for economic development. So we started working at the community level. And that took many years to put together. We knew that we needed to focus on roads and infrastructure. We know that we needed to get a government structure in place. That's where our people really started to focus in on our own government. Without decision-making by government, such as our community, it's very difficult to move things ahead at the speed of business. And so for us, we focused in on that. And it became clear that we needed agreements with Canada and with the province of British Columbia to have our governance recognized. And so we spent many years negotiating with the government of Canada to ensure that we had a self-government regime in place to allow us to move with our own decision-making. Once we had that in place, we looked firstly by agreements. We looked firstly at a land code and land management. It was very important for us to have that governance authority to be able to manage our own lands and our resources on our reserve lands. And the land code that we negotiated with Canada allowed us to do that. And it became a start for us to really intensify developments, to attract developers to come on to our lands. We also knew that we needed to have the taxation, the property taxation in place, which we negotiated and also put that in place so that people who lived within the reserve boundaries of Westbank First Nation paid the property taxes to us as the government. And that creates a lot of revenue to put back into the lands for sewage lines, for water lines, for roads, for community structures. And that allowed us then to attract developers that were interested in developing lands. And once we pursued that, things started moving very, very quickly. And as time moved on and we learned more about development, then we started looking at doing the developments ourselves. Not only in joint ventures, but then looking at taking control of the various developments by learning how to do it. And through time, we've moved on immensely. Today, for example, we have a 50% ownership of one of our shopping centers, the Lake Okanagan Shopping Center. Another shopping center we have a 40% interest in, and that is a shopping center in downtown Westbank on the reserve, which is the Sinyatan development. And in future projects, we're looking at building and expanding the shopping centers ourselves. We probably will not need.
Chief Robert Louis, we are very motivated to listen to you about this vision of future. How do you include women, the youth, and how do you do to give that kind of vision for economic development to the new generations?
Well, all of our peoples are very, very important. I'll start with the youth. The youth are the future decision makers of our community, and every community, I think, must understand that. And so we have to look after our youth. Our youth are very important, so we must keep them on the right path. So we need to develop, and we have developed programs for them, recreational programs, mentorship programs, training opportunities. And more recently, for our youth, we are building a new youth center that will focus strictly for the programs for our youth, to help them learn business, to help them learn to be leaders, to keep them occupied so they're not on drugs and alcohol and things of that nature. And if we keep them focused, we believe that gives them the opportunity then to look and to work to be the leaders and to be the community participants that will make the whole community strong. And the youth are very, very important for that, as well as to understand their culture and to respect their culture, respect their elders. And with women, of course, there is complete equality in our communities. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. Everyone is treated equally as they should be, and every opportunity is done the same way. And that is something that our community is very, very strong on. At some point in time, we may have a woman chief. That is inevitable in time. We have had women on council, for example, decision makers at that level, and that happens. And it is good to have both men and women involved in decision making, political or otherwise. Very, very important for us, as well as to have a complete working relationship with our elders. Our elders provide us a guidance.
Promote a culture of peace inside of communities. We have seen here that in Canada, that in First Nations, people are very respectful, people are hardworking people, but they always like to protect their family, their communities.
Yes.
How do you promote that culture inside of your community?
Firstly, by respecting everyone within the community. Respect is something that is valued, and everyone must have their say. And it must be respectfully heard and acknowledged. And that's something that our governance requires. And so when we pass laws, for example, our community has a say in that lawmaking capacity. They will decide. We have 3 readings, for example. First reading, where council will propose the law, a second reading where it goes to the community for their input, and then the third reading back at council once we've canvassed the community members to make sure that there is support for that law, then that law is passed by the council. So there is that involvement, and our membership, I believe, relate to that because they know they have a say. Nothing is done without their input. That's extremely important, and that's one side of things. The other side of the equation is that all of our language and practice of our culture must be understood, particularly by the youth and the young ones, to understand that they have a heritage, they have a language, and that should be practiced. So in our St. Houston School, for example, we have teaching of our Okanagan Syilx language so that they can become conversant to the language, to understand that. They have that opportunity. And to be able to do the drumming and to do our native dancing and to practice our cultures, that is extremely important. To complement that, we have provided and sought and have in place now a heritage museum. It's called Sensuweeps Museum, and that museum protects our culture. It has artifacts stored and secured, and it's a meeting place not only of our community but of the non-natives and visitors who come to our lands so they see who we are, where we've been, how we practice our culture, and it has pictures and the past, the present, and in some cases the future. And that, I believe, is something that really works well within our community, and it helps to bring the respect and the understanding and the practice of our culture and who we are as a people together.
Friends, we're going now for a commercial, but we'll be back soon in a few seconds with our TV program, Investment and Development. back with our TV program Investment and Development and our special interview with Chief Robert Louis from First Nation Westbank.
Chief Robert Louis, we are very glad to listen your vision. We are very glad that you have been changing and improving the life of your people. How do you combine your work as a chief leader with your personal business? Because we understand that you are a businessman and you have your own companies also.
Yes, thank you, Luis. I do have several of my own businesses, and it's something I work very hard on as well. So what I do is I generally I have 7 days within the week, and I usually work all 7 days. And I will start very early in the morning, and I will put in long hours. So for me, 15 to 18 hours per day is very average for me to work. Within that working time, I'm very cautious of the things that I must accomplish, and I will work on the most important matters first. Certainly my community certainly comes first. Working with chiefs across Canada is something that's very dear to me, and that is also a priority. So for me, if I'm looking at my personal businesses, it always comes last. And so for me, I have been able to retain good help with my own businesses. I have several of my family, for example, who work in the business. One of the businesses that I'm currently undertaking now is building a winery and distillery, and pursuing that very vigorously at the moment. And we are now at the production level of producing Indigenous world wines. And it is a family affair, and I have my son, my daughter, my wife, and family members all working very hard at making it successful. So that is part of the balance that I do. I believe that all of the businesses that I operate in, I'm very, very careful not to have conflicts. If there are conflicts, if they do exist, then they are declared. One of the laws that my community has with the Westbank First Nation is to do things like declare all conflicts. And so if there is a conflict of business or things that I would like to do, and if it conflicts with the community, then it has to be declared right at the council tables where we meet as a government organization. So that is always done, and it's followed very religiously, not only by me, but the other council members as well. So there's a good balance that's imposed, that is required not only by law, but is required morally to ensure that there is fairness and accountability, and it ensures that there is no conflicts that will happen.
You are handling this in very professional way.
Yes.
Chief Robert Louis, we know that energy is present and is the future also.
Yes.
And we see that Canada is taking advantage of all natural resources.
Yes.
How do you see the mining, the hydroelectrics, all that kind of investments in different communities that are going to help bringing investments, creating jobs, giving opportunities for the present and for the future?
Well, there are tremendous opportunities, and I look at the community of Souk here on Vancouver Island. The Souk Nation is one of the most intensified communities that have solar energy and within their communities. And they're using it not only for their housing needs, but they're using it for production needs. So I see solar energy, for example, being done by communities like this very beautiful community of Souk. The Souk Nation are advancing the technology and working with companies to ensure that they are breaking through with the solar energy and those requirements. And that work, I believe, is being shared, and it must be shared. And one of the things that is happening now is working with Indigenous peoples now around the world. And Souk is certainly a leader in the solar energy. In other areas, be it oil extraction, let's say from Fort McMurray in Alberta, to have the pipelines put in place, it's a very debatable issue. There are some First Nations and members of the public who support it, and others who do not. And so there has to be that balance. One thing that's very clear, that if oil is going to be extracted from the lands in Canada, be it by First Nations or other peoples, it has to be done very carefully and very environmentally sensitively to make sure that the cleanest and the best methods are used. So that means that if oil is going to be shipped across oceans, it has to be done so in the very most precise ways. So with the oil pipelines, for example, it must be done in a very ecologically supportive way. And so crude oil, for example, cannot be taken in and put on ships that have unsafe harbors, for example. There are passages, say the Queen Charlotte Islands in the Terrace, British Columbia area, Prince Rupert. For example, some of those areas are very too much sensitive to have large ships with oil being extracted and through those inlets. It has to be in areas that are not as sensitive to the environment. And perhaps it shouldn't be crude, perhaps it should be refined oil. Oil that floats. If oil is going to be taken across the ocean, it has to be such that if there is a catastrophe, that it can be cleaned up. And having oils that are manageable, as opposed to crude, which will sink to the ocean floors and create damage. That is something that has to be prevented. It has to float, and if there is that catastrophe, there has to be ways to clean that up.
Chief Louis, you're one of the pioneers, also from the person that signed the protocol in Guatemala for creating the economic development models for indigenous tribes all around the world. How do you see now that the global network of indigenous entrepreneurs has been created? So how does First Nations, indigenous communities in Guatemala, all the indigenous communities around the world can have this opportunity to develop in an economical way?
Well, the protocol was the start, being signed by myself and other indigenous peoples around the world. That protocol is something that needs to be further supported around the world. I believe that the support will grow to hundreds of thousands of signatures, I think, over time, and that's quickly getting there now. I think that there has to be many more meetings with indigenous peoples and leaders throughout the world. I believe there is the next meeting coming up in Hawaii in October, and that will be another time for indigenous peoples to further foster the networking, to come up with ideas and solutions of how we can share services, goods, how we can work to support one another, be it in Guatemala, Chile, Canada, United States, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, any place in the world. I think that we can work together, and there is no reasons why we cannot support one another, to have trade, to buy products from one another, to exchange services, to use the services of indigenous peoples throughout the world so that all of our indigenous peoples can benefit. I think the strength is with unity, and this Economic Development Forum will help foster huge economic benefits for all of us as peoples in this world.
Now, to share, to connect, and inspire. Chief Louis, thank you very much for being in Investment and Development Guatemalan program, that we share your experience all over the world. And people that are watching us, please stay with us for the next week. We are going to present another successful case.
Cuando pienso en mi Guatemala, el más bello paraíso, tan grande en historia, tan lleno de vida, me siento